So, recording started, and clicky. Beautiful. Yeah, again, nice to see everybody. So, the plan for today is yet more Grice. And this is a little bit of stuff that's extending his picture that we talked about last time. So, if you remember, I know it was a while ago, given the midterms and everything, Grice's overall project is to have what we might think of as an intention-based semantics, right? The project is to ground everything, meaning in terms of speakers' intentions. And these speakers' intentions need to be reflexive in the sense that in order for it to work, it can't just be intended. The audience must also uptake the intention, and their uptaking the intention must be at least partial cause for why they come to believe whatever it is you're trying to convey. And so this was Grice's big project. And that's what we were talking about last time. And again, same picture because I tried to find more pictures of Grice and literally cannot. Or at least pictures that I'm not sure aren't Dummett instead of Grice, which isn't very helpful. But Grice's project, as we talked about it last week, isn't complete. And Grice certainly didn't think so, because even if the intention-based semantics went through, there's still more stuff that's going on with language than his semantic story would actually make sense of. And what we're going to talk about today is Grice making the first moves towards filling the picture out. So the way we're going to talk about it is broadly following, if you like, the structure of the paper. Did people get a chance to read the paper? So I really like this one. I think it's a very neat paper. I love Grice's style. It's hard sometimes to kind of pull out exactly what he's trying to do and what the kind of moves being made are. So hopefully I can kind of highlight some of that stuff for you and we can talk a little bit about it. So what we'll start off with is by talking about two ways. I got also a beautiful typo there. Should be formalism versus informalism, not formatalism, whatever the hell that is. So, talk about a comparison between two views about the nature of language. And that will give us a springboard to talk about a difference between two verbs, as silly as it sounds. One we'll just take as basic saying, and the other is this term of art that Grice introduces in this paper called implicating, or implicature. And we'll try and pull these two apart. And once we have them, that will set us up to talk about what Grice is really interested in, which is the notion of conversational implicatures. Once we have this, we're going to be able to give a full story. It will be the intention-based semantics plus this, which we'll call pragmatics, together, which will give us an explanation of how communication works with language. Those two together are going to be the full account. And we'll wrap up by going through a bunch of examples. Because Grice's paper is nothing if not just example after example after example after example. It's notable that Grice is actually the founder of a lot of different schools in linguistics. So not formal linguistics, but Grice's program is something that was very much taken up by people who are interested in language in this sort of rigorous way, and his method of building things and his method of working by example is something that a lot of linguists still do. Something we can talk a little bit about later. So that's the plan, and then we'll say a little bit something about how all of this kind of wraps up and what we'll do on the next couple weeks. So that's the plan. So first, let's talk about informalism versus formalism. And the way to come at this debate is by thinking about the relationship between natural and formal languages. So a natural language is something like English or Dutch or German, the kind of language we actually speak. And a formal language, well, this is the kind of thing that we worked on in things like the logic class, or that you might have with set theory. It's a very specific, or actually a programming language is another kind of a formal language. It's a language that's designed for specific purposes. Often it's going to have extremely limited grammar, extremely restrictive kind of composition rules, so extremely restrictive syntax, and often explicitly formulated semantics. So again, something like truth functional logic, propositional or sentential logic, did this a few years ago. This is a formal language. And it's designed for one thing. It's designed to help you track, in TFL's case, validity. Right? We want to track truth functionality, and the language is designed just to do that. We don't care about anything else. So you might wonder, what's the relationship between English, say, and something like first-order logic, which is pretty damn close to English in terms of expressive power? Not the same, but close. Which one's better, to put it really crassly? Which one better describes the world, or is more effective as a tool for communication? Now, do we kind of get the question? So, again, which is the better tool? A formalist, according to Grice, is going to say, look, the formal device is better. The formal language is better, in some sense of better. And it's better because it possesses, as he puts it, a decisive advantage over the natural language counterpart. Because it's more perspicuous. It's got clear definitions. It's got explicit decision procedures about how you can go from one kind of sentence to another kind. For those of you who took the logic class, right, remember natural deduction, the rules that we had for natural deduction that tell us exactly the kinds of things you could derive from certain sorts of sentences. This is the kind of advantage that a formal language has. Natural language doesn't have that. There's no clear, explicit decision procedures. Often the terms we want to use, hey, aren't explicitly defined, or there isn't any way really to cash out the notions. And by God, natural language is not fucking perspicuous. Right? Okay. That's one point. That's the kind of formalist camp. And this is sort of halfway between a steel man and a straw man version of the formalist. That is, it's the absolute extreme version of what this position might be. In contrast, we have what Grice calls the informalist. And the informalist just says, no, I think natural language is better. Again, just to read the quote, he says, there are many inferences and arguments expressed in natural language and not in terms of those formal devices that are nevertheless recognizably valid. So there must be a place for an unsimplified and so more or less unsystematic logic of the natural counterparts of these formal devices. So the thought is, look, if we're actually comparing formal languages, even the best ones we've developed, but what happens in natural language always outstrips our formal devices. We can do more in natural language than we can in any formal language. And that's why this is more powerful. That's why this is better. Even if it's a mess, and even if you don't have explicit definitions, and even if exactly what you can derive is a clusterfuck, it's just better. Natural language does more. Again, these are kind of an extreme version of the two positions, but we can see the kind of pull. And we've actually seen something like this debate. Right? Maybe not quite in these terms, but something like Russell's position, if we really push it. We think about the debate between Russell and Strawson. Russell's position, something like this. Natural language is bad for doing philosophy. What we need is a better language. Let's move to formal logic. Frege, in one of the footnotes in the very, very first paper we actually read, he even says, look, a perfect language isn't going to have these problems. These problems only come up in natural language. That's because natural language sucks. We want a beautiful, formal device. That's exactly what we really need. On the flip side, somebody like Austin, or Grice, or Strawson, arguably, is pushing for something along these informalist lines. Natural language is extremely useful and powerful, and these formal tools might be very helpful, but they mislead us. Or at least they don't get everything. Though we can kind of come at this debate a little bit stronger, but do we see the two positions, at least in their rough and ready characterization? So I'm going to probably give you some bad flashbacks. Let's talk about formal logic again. In particular, let's think about the Boolean connectives, right? The sentential connectives. I'm only going to talk about three. Let's talk about conjunction. So conjunction is, we've said way back in the logic class, this little thing that looks like an A without the line through it. This expresses and. Or it's supposed to express and. Something like and, or but, or although, or even though. And from a purely formal perspective, from our truth functional logic, we read it this way, right? These are the input values for the sentences, and this is the resulting value for the output sentence, the conjunctive sentence. So the conjunction is only true if both parts are true. Grass is green and snow is white is true if and only if grass is green and snow is white. If even one lets us down, then the conjunction is false. Now, this is our beautiful formal treatment of conjunction. What's notable is that it doesn't actually match up with how we talk about things in natural language. We'll talk more about this in just a second. But remember, keep this in the back of your head as we go along. Right. So here's another truth functional connective, hopefully a very familiar one. This is the V. This is our disjunction. It expresses or. It's the kind of either or, at least that's the idea. So it's going to be true if even one side's true. The only time it's false is if both sides let it down. Again, does this actually capture the English or? Probably not. Because oftentimes in English, when we say or, we mean an exclusive or. In fact, I remember the number of times trying to remind people that it's inclusive or whenever we're symbolizing it together. So if this is supposed to somehow map to the natural language, something's gone a little bit off. It's close, and maybe it's the best we're going to do truth functionally, but it doesn't exactly capture the natural language. And the last one is the one that is just absolutely fucking, right? And that's the conditional. So our error, hopefully everybody remembers the conditional, right? The conditional is really weird. And the conditional is really weird. It's supposed to capture the idea of if-then. So if A, then B. That's what this is supposed to tell us. But when we do it truth functionally, we get some weird results. Because whenever A is false, the conditional is true. Doesn't matter what the relationship is between A and B. And again, if this is what our formal language is telling us, that does not seem to match up very well with natural language. So just to kind of draw this out, again, we have all of these in the back of our heads. Think about some cases. Let's take our first one with conjunction. Here's two sentences. He got drunk and drove home. And our second sentence, he drove home and got drunk. Did these say the same thing? I mean, it doesn't feel like it, right? It doesn't feel like it at all. One of them sounds like somebody did something a little dangerous, and the other sounds like someone maybe needs some help. Somebody's had a bad week, so they just went home and got drunk on their own. Somebody got drunk and put a bunch of people in danger. Again, can we sort of see that in the way the sentences are? Now, on the formal aspect, if we formalize these, there is no difference between these two. Because conjunction is symmetric. It doesn't matter if I symbolize it as drunk, drove home, or drove home, drunk. It doesn't matter what order I put them in the formal language. But it seems to matter in natural language. Because the order I say them seems to suggest temporal order. Right? The first sentence suggests dude got drunk and then drove. Second one suggests dude drove and then drank. Do we feel it? Here's another one. Either he's at the bar or he's hard at work, and he's at the bar. Now that seems really weird. I think the thought is this sentence sounds strange. This isn't the sort of thing people would actually say. Because it seems to suggest from the first bit that it's not really clear. And then the second clause says, oh, but actually it is really clear, which is weird. But note, actually, if we're thinking about this purely formally, there was nothing wrong with saying this. It's just saying, in fact, if we know this is true, this automatically follows. If we have P, then P or Q is always going to be true. Because remember, or just means at least one side. So if you know P or Q, it doesn't even matter what Q is. So from a formal perspective, this is not weird to say. This is very natural to say. But from a natural language perspective, you'd be like, what? Maybe the best explanation is someone said this, then they looked at their phone and realized where the person was. We'd have to tell a story to make sense. And the last one is just simply, we think about what happens with the conditionals in everyday language, right? Here are two very weird conditionals. If there are exactly 50 people in this room, then there are exactly 5,000. And another one, if my name's Derek, then Tilburg is in the Netherlands. Now read simply as natural language conditionals, what do we think? True? False? Do they make any sense? No, yeah, kind of fair, right? Neither of them really make much fucking sense. Of course, in the formal language, they're both true. If we formalize these, they both have to be true. The first one's true because there ain't anywhere close to exactly 50 people, so the conditional is always going to be true. And the second one's true because Tilburg is in the Netherlands, so it doesn't matter what the antecedent is. So what's going on here is, again, we have all of these weird little sentences in natural language. They pull us in different ways, they suggest different things, and then when we try and map them onto our formal language, things don't quite go exactly as we want. So this is kind of building up a little bit for Grice's point, because remember where we started. Which one's better, the formal language or the natural language? Well, based on all of these, it looks like our formal language, if that's the best we've got, is a long way off from capturing what we want. It suggests pretty strongly that Grice is right. Or at least he's on the right track. Okay. So, do we kind of feel the tension here? Again, we're trying to capture these things with our formalism, and our formalism is awesome, but sometimes it doesn't quite do what we want it to do. So we might be pulled towards this kind of informal story. Notably, in these cases, to use those examples we were just talking about, it doesn't seem like there's an entailment or a presupposition. Whatever's happening here is not those two. Again, we can draw this up by thinking about this one. He got drunk and drove home. Well, there's definitely no entailed temporal ordering, because that's presumably what the formal logic is actually going to capture. It's the entailment. And there's no presupposition of temporal ordering, but there is some suggestion that it went drinking first, driving second. So the notion that we're going to characterize is this. It's going to tell us and give us a term to describe why it is that we feel like there's an order here. And just to spoil it, this is going to be implicature. So it's not strictly speaking part of what's said, but it's part of what's told, part of what you're being told. So let's come at this by talking about the example, one of the examples from the very beginning of Grice's paper. We have two people, A and B, and they're talking about a mutual friend, C. And C has just started working at a bank. So A asks B how C is getting on in their new job. Fairly typical kind of conversation, right? Though of course in a very Oxford-style English, so it's a little bit of itself. And B replies, so, oh, C's getting along quite well, I think. He likes his colleagues, and he hasn't been to prison yet. Hasn't been sent to prison yet. So A kind of hears that and is just like, what? What do you mean by that? So what's pretty clear, sorry, this should say note that whatever it is that B is suggesting, what they meant, it's not going to be what is said here in any strict sense. Because what's said here in any strict sense is really obvious. C hasn't been sent to prison yet. That's it. But that's not the kind of thing A's asking about. A's follow-up is like, why did you mention that? Why is this a relevant bit of information here? Why did you need to mention that this person hasn't been sent to prison yet? What are you trying to suggest? So there isn't anything in what's said, but there's something conveyed. More generally, when we think about conversations, what's meant or what's conveyed often goes well beyond what is strictly said. This additional information is effectively inferred by the listener. It's going to arise from contextual factors, but notably, it's predictable. That is, even if you're not necessarily that specific listener, if you're familiar with the context, you have some relevant background knowledge, you can figure out what's going on. Not always. Sometimes there'll be specific information because of the certain context, the conversational context, but you can figure it out. So let's introduce the verb, to implicate. To implicate is the verb we're going to use to capture that notion. It's the same thing that happened with he got drunk and drove home. What's said is there are two things that occurred. Dude drove, dude drank. What's implicated is the order. I said it this way because that's the order that it happened in. First drinking, then driving. Similarly, to go back a slide, right, with this kind of thing, they're implicating something. Exactly what it is, we need to be told more. As it's described, this is too vague. But what they're trying to convey, that's driven by implicature. So it's not part of what's said, but it's part of what's being implicated. This is the magic extra ingredient that was missing. That extra stuff that's being conveyed that isn't part of the semantics, that isn't part of just what's being said. To give you another grip on it, let's take sentence one. Amanda ate some of the cookies. This happens a lot. Now, strictly speaking, what does this say? Well, this says Amanda ate some of the cookies. She ate a portion of the cookies. But no, her eating a portion of the cookies, or I should say A, not Pat, right? Her eating a portion of the cookies is strictly compatible with her eating 100% of the cookies. That is, all of them. Because some just means at least some, but it's also compatible with all. But no, if you heard that, if I told you Amanda ate some of the cookies, you would probably respond something like, I figured she would, how many are left? That is, what you're already going to do is take that this first utterance suggests Amanda didn't eat all. She ate some, not all. Even though, strictly speaking, Amanda ate some of the cookies is perfectly compatible with her eating all of them.
Formal language.
In the formal language, yeah. But in the informal too. So you can think about it this way, right? It's perfectly fine for me to say something like this. Amanda ate some of the cookies. In fact, she ended up eating all of them. What would be weird, though, is for me to say this. Amanda ate some of the cookies. In fact, she didn't eat any. That's impossible. That's a contradiction. This one, though, no contradiction at all. That's the trick. Because there's no contradiction here, we can already feel the entailment's fine. So again, what we're drawing out here is when I say something like 1, there's a strong suggestion of 3. Not entailed. If it was entailed, this would be a contradiction. But there's no contradiction in my saying Amanda ate some of the cookies. In fact, she ate all of them. Not like there's a contradiction in Amanda ate some. In fact, she didn't eat any. That doesn't make any damn sense. So what's going on in this little mini dialogue? How do we go from 1 to 3? What's filling it in? Well, there's a kind of inference. And the inference from 1 to 3 involves understanding the conventions of what we'll call communicative exchanges. That's Grice's term for conversations. It's a very weird and uncomfortable term, so we'll just use conversation. So a speaker utters 1, and in so doing, what do they convey? They convey the literal meaning. Again, what's the literal meaning? That Amanda ate some of the cookies. She ate a portion. Now, the addressee believes that the speaker is operating in a spirit of cooperation. That is, they're engaging in this conversation with the aim of being as informative as possible. So based on that assumption, and given that the speaker just said 1, the addressee reasons that, look, if the speaker knew Amanda ate all the cookies, they would have said that. But since they didn't say Amanda ate all the cookies, they just said Amanda ate some, they must mean that she didn't eat all. She only ate a less than whole portion. Do we see the thought? So again, what happens? Just to go back to the case. 1 is said, and 1 strictly is compatible with all. But our hearer, recognizing that if the speaker would have said all, then it would have meant all, and they didn't say that, reasons, oh cool, she must have only eaten some and not all. There's a kind of inference driven by this idea that what's going on is the speaker and hearer are operating in a spirit of cooperation. The two of them are trying to work together to convey information as efficiently and informatively as possible. That's going to be the linch to the whole thing. Everything's going to turn on that one pin. If you have this going, you can run this kind of inference in the background. So the thought is going to be our addressee, our hearer, takes what's explicitly said, adds some extra information they derive, they infer, and together that's going to give us a complete and as informative response as possible. That's Grice's project for this implicature stuff in a nutshell. So, we have what's said, what's explicitly conveyed. This is often going to be conventional. That is, it's closely related to the conventional meaning of sentential parts, right? That makes sense, especially coming from Grice's project, where it's going to be intentionally driven. Why am I using the sound Amanda to refer to Amanda? Well, because of convention. That's the sound that everyone's familiar with to refer to her. Context can matter if we're using things like indexicals. So, I ate all the cookies. Right? You need context in order to catch out who I is. But notably, context isn't overly important. You can learn a lot about what's said without having any particular heavy-duty contextual knowledge. You might need it for stuff like indexicals, but for most of it, just simply the conventional meaning is going to do the job. To go back again, you don't really need to know much to understand what one says. Contrast that with what's implicated. what's conveyed that isn't said. Here, the big thing is it's not strictly speaking there. So notably, Grice talks about this. If an utterance implicates something false, it may yet be strictly speaking true. Similarly, what we're going to do is sometimes going to be conventional, but not always. We'll talk more about some examples. You can have implicatures conveyed by the conventional meanings of the words as they're used. Grice's example of this is, he's an Englishman, he's brave, which is not a very good example at the moment. So the thought here is, if we look at this utterance, this statement, there's an implicature that he's brave because he's English. That is, Englishness entails braveness. And note that that's driven entirely by the conventional meaning of these things. There's nothing kind of baked in about it. It's just simply the structure of this and the order we express them in that's doing the implicature. Importantly also, with this notion of implicature, and this is a big key, it's going to be governed by norms of rationality. So what we mean by that is the implicatures are going to arise from facts about how conversations work and the fact that conversations are governed by commonly known rules. Implicit maxims that we all know and operate with, even if we don't explicitly know that we're operating with them. More on those in just a second. And the nice, really cool one, this is how you know you're dealing with an implicature and not what's said, is you can cancel it and it makes sense. Again, go back to the Amanda case. Amanda ate some of the cookies. In fact, she ate all of them. That's me canceling the implicature that she didn't eat all of them and rounding it out to say, in fact, when I said some, I really should have said all. Similar case, to kind of return to our opening one, with A and B talking about C being sent to prison. B might say something like, he hasn't been to prison yet, but by that I don't mean that he's actually a bad guy, right? Or is the sort that gets into trouble often. Of course, then you follow it up with, cool, what the hell did you mean then? I'm still confused. So, again, before we move on to talk about the general theory, do we have a grip on this kind of difference between saying and implying, or implicature, and what's said? Does the difference kind of make sense? Okay. So, what Grice wants to do is give us an overall theory about implicature. And in particular, he's really going to focus on one species. And to get to the one species, it's helpful to get what Grice thinks underpins all communication, or at least all conversation. So Grice proposes that participants in a communicative exchange, a conversation, are guided by a principle that determines the way language is used with maximum efficiency and effect for rational communication. And he calls this the cooperative principle. I'm going to read it and we'll unpack it. So the cooperative principle says, make your conversational contribution such as required at the stage at which it occurs by the accepted purpose or direction of the talk exchange in which you are engaged. So what's this really saying? It's basically saying, look, whenever you're in a particular conversation, whatever you're going to do, whatever move you're going to make sure it fits and it does the job that you want it to do. And exactly the job it's supposed to do. Again, the working thought here is that whenever we're engaged in a conversation, people are making specific and particular moves. And the moves they're making are designed or intended to satisfy exactly the thing that they want them to satisfy. It's a little bit generous for many of us in conversation. I don't know about you, but I'm often just breaking this on accident because I'm just fucking floundering around trying to say something. But if we work with something like this in the background, it makes sense. What's conversation? It's an exchange of information. And people are trying to exchange that information as efficiently and effectively as they can. And the cooperative principle says, do that. Make the moves in the discussion that are going to help you most effectively and efficiently get what you want from it. Now, this cooperative principle is effectively an umbrella term. It's going to break down into more specific components. These specific components are in some sense distinct from, and in another sense, constitutive parts of this principle. This is the big one, though. And Grice is going to say all conversation is behaving according to this principle. Or if it's not, that's because someone is explicitly violating it when they're like lying. And that's one of the interesting things about what's going on with lying. You make people think you're behaving according to this, but you're not. So, let's break the cooperative principle down. The cooperative principle effectively breaks into 4 maxims. Again, we can think about these either as constitutive parts or as supplements that just bring out features of the cooperative principle. First one are maxims of quality. And the maxims of quality say things like, don't say what you believe to be false, and don't say what you lack sufficient or adequate evidence for. And note that what counts as adequate evidence can vary with context. So in everyday or general conversation, don't say stuff you know is false, don't say stuff you don't have adequate evidence for, adequate here being contextually determined. That's our first maxim. To go along with quality, we have quantity. Make your contribution as informatively as required, and also, don't make it too informative. Don't say more than is necessary. I have a big problem with this one. I often tell stories with too many fucking details in them, right? I'm sure you all have friends who do the same kind of thing, right? So quality basically says, look, tell the truth, or at least tell as close as you can to the truth. Quantity says, give as much and no more than what's required.
With the adequate evidence means that certain sentences are representing some context and other.
Yeah. So in certain contexts, it's going to be perfectly adequate to say, oh, I know that the bank's open tomorrow. And in other contexts, if we really need to cash this check, otherwise we're financially ruined, yeah, that's perfectly fine. So again, remember, all of these are going to be driven by a kind of contextual situation. The same thing with informativeness too, right? If I know that you know your way around Tilburg, I can say, oh, it's just down the road near Ollie's, or something like this. If I've got a guess, I'll need to be much more specific. Okay, so those are our first 2. Again, quality, try and stick as close to truth. Quantity, be as informative and no more than necessary. 2 more, slightly less helpful. Maximum of relevance, be relevant! Right. Exactly what counts as relevant is also going to be contextually determinate or dependent. Basically, this is don't start telling stories about frogs if you're in the middle of explaining a mathematical proof, unless it's somehow going to come back. And the last one is maxims of manner. So relevance tells you something about, hey, the content needs to somehow be associated with what you were just talking about. Manner has to do with the delivery. So it's things like avoid obscurity of expression, avoid ambiguity, be brief, be orderly, be perspicuous. Grice also says, one might meet others. Again, what's the kind of underlying thought? Well, relevance is whatever the hell you're talking about, your contribution should be about that. And manner is whatever your conversational contribution is, make it nice. So, what, again, are the thoughts here? What's the cooperative principle and the maxim supposed to be doing? They're supposed to be describing how conversation normally works. These are meant to be underpinning all conversations. And what's going to happen, just to spoil, I think, the next slide maybe, is when we're thinking about implicatures, always, but not always, often, but not always, we're going to be violating one of these maxims. And it's in violating it that we're going to spark the recognition to get people to figure out the extra stuff we're saying. Yeah?
What's the difference between the manner of being brief and the not giving too much information?
So importantly, when we say be brief, it's literally just about the formulation of this sentence. So you might have something where, look, as you know, and of course, as we're all very familiar, and I really even hate to add this, but the table's white, something like this, versus the table's white, and actually it was made in 1874 by a craftsman, where we're adding extra propositions, as it were, rather than just simply thinking about sentence construction. That's really the kind of difference here. Though, to be honest, a lot of these blur and mix. He puts them forward as if they're very clearly distinct. They are not. It's very, very hard to figure out exactly what relevance is and how maybe the difference between ambiguity and obscurity of expression, something like this is. Again, we can kind of see the idea. So those are the four. This gives us the core of Grice's theory underlying conversation. We have the cooperative principle governing, and underneath that we have the maxims of conversation. Make your contribution one that's true or as close to it as you can. Make your contribution exactly as informative as needed. Be relevant and be perspicuous. Now, following the cooperative principle and the maxims ensures that in a conversation, the right amount of information is going to be exchanged. And that whatever's happening is being conducted in a truthful, relevant, and coherent or perspicuous manner. Everybody can follow along. And everybody can follow along because nobody's fucking it up. So again, that's the kind of background idea with regards to conversation, according to Grice. Now we can come back and talk about whether we think this is right. But that's the first move. Now, once we have that as a background, we can think about what conversants actually do. In conversations, you can do one of four things with regards to the principle and the maxims. You can observe them. That is, you just sort of do what the maxims say. Don't break them. You can opt out. And this is where you use a phrase or something like this to say, okay, I'm going to cancel obeying this. This is where we say something like, I'm not so sure about this, where we have a kind of hedge sentence or a hedge phrase. You probably already know this, but that kind of thing. You can flout a maxim, and this is where you violate or break a maxim with the full knowledge of the person you're doing it to. Or you can violate a maxim. And exactly what the difference between these two is a little bit hard, and Grice is not entirely clear about this. But arguably the big difference between these is that the latter, the violation, often involves breaking these things without the knowledge of your addressee. So flouting is when we're breaking it and everyone knows. All the participants know. And violating is when at least one of the people involved in the conversation doesn't know that the principles are being broken. So this is the kind of thing that happens when you lie. Right? Quality is violated if you lie because you're saying something you know to be false. But you don't want the addressee to clock it. Whereas if you're being ironic, right, that would be an instance of flouting because the person you're talking to knows that what you're saying is strictly speaking false.
And if the person doesn't understand irony?
Yeah, so in that case, what we have is a kind of failure at the conversational level. In that case, we need to even back up and make sure that we can get everybody on the same page to get the conversation going. Because that's almost just like we're trying to have a conversation and it's not even going. That's the best explanation I can kind of give there. Alternatively, what could happen, and this might happen sometimes, is you're inadvertently violating. And what might happen then is later on, when it becomes clear the other person didn't understand that you were flouting, you can correct it by making explicit what you were trying to implicate. Say, oh, sorry, what I meant by that was this. Because, of course, the best jokes are the ones you explain later. Especially when it's because the other party didn't get it. So this gives us a way to characterize implicature. We can say that a speaker S implicates Q by saying that P, sorry, but this is in handy way to get it off, right? Where Q is some content and P is some sentence, expression, proposition. If and only if S is to be presumed to be observing the maxims, or at least the cooperative principle, right? So they've got to be obeying those conversational rules. And it's common knowledge between S and her audience that S could say P while obeying the principle and maxims only if they're expressing Q. So, to kind of unpack that, the thought is, we're going to implicate something if, and this is I think what's literally on the next slide, right, what's said plus what's implicated gives you the maxims. That is the only way that our speaker could actually be obeying the conversational rules is if you add in the stuff that they're not saying. So this helps us think about a kind of way to work it out. Right? We're going to have to know the conventional meanings of the words used. We need to know what's being said. We're going to need to know the conversational principle, the cooperative principle, and the maxims. We're going to need to know context, background knowledge that's relevant. We're going to need to know all of the above are available to all the participants. And we also have to know that all the participants are aware of all of these. And that they're obeying the rules too. So there's actually a lot of stuff going on. But weirdly, that doesn't seem that wrong. If we think about how conversations go, and what happens when people seem to kind of not get what's happening. Arguably, it's going to be because they're failing in one of these aspects. They're not in the common ground. They don't know what everyone else is already assuming or working on, and that's why they haven't quite clicked with what everyone's saying yet. So, again, the big thought, the deep dark thought, Bryce's fundamental assumption is that all conversational partners are behaving according to something like the cooperative principle. If he's wrong about this, this whole story is just bullshit. And notably, they have to be doing this even if it isn't evident that they are, even if they don't explicitly know it. Because it's assuming this that allows us to generate the inferences that are going to tell us what's supposedly being implicated. Again, go back to the slide where I was talking about Amanda's eating some of the cookies. The thought here was, I said that, and because I just said some and not all, we can infer that she didn't eat all of them. Why? Because that if I would have said just some and not all, and I knew it was all, I would have violated the rule of quantity. I should have told you the most perspicuous information. And if I only said some and not all, I violated a rule. I broke the conversational rules. But assuming I'm behaving according to the rules, there's a good inference to be made here. Again, it all stems from obeying these. And the thought is that observing the maxims at a non-literal level, that is, taking what's said plus what's implicated together, is what's going to get us back to the maxims. The conversational implicature comes in as filling in the gap from what's said to the maxims. No, sorry, okay. No. So the process is the listener assumes that the speaker is following the maxims, so whenever what's said doesn't get you there, you fill in the gap with some inferences, and that filling in the gap is the implication. Again, this will kind of work itself out with some examples. This is why it's really helpful that we have like 10,000 of them. Okay. But do we get the process? Does it make sense? It's a beautiful picture. Absolutely gorgeous picture. Just between friends. Total horseshit. My God, if it would work, it would be amazing. The problem is it's not really clear everybody's doing this. But we'll come back to that. So, we know now how to generate implicatures. Let's think about cases. And Grice talks about 3 broad classes, or groups. Implicatures where the maxims are all observed and something funny happens. Implicatures where maxims are violated, but it's because of a clash. And the most interesting ones, the ones that actually tend to be where the real interesting stuff happens, where maxims are flouted. Let's talk about cases of each sort. Again, what are we talking about? Observing, that's obeying the rules. Violating is breaking them, but breaking them perhaps without the knowledge of the hearer. And flouting is one where everybody's in the know. So, implicatures where the maxims are all observed. Grice's example of this, I think, is a nice one. Actually, Grice's 2 examples of this are both kind of nice. Here's our first one. We have A pulls up in their car and says, look, I'm out of petrol. And the hearer responds, oh, there's a garage around the corner. Now, what's going on here? So what's explicitly said by B is, there's a garage around the corner. But what's the implicature? What are they trying to convey? What do they want A to figure out? Well, if A says I'm out of petrol, and B is saying there's a garage around the corner, B is hoping that A can figure out you go to the garage to get gas. That's why B is saying it. B is obeying all of the things. B is obeying relevance, in particular in this case. But A has to figure out why this is relevant. And it's by figuring out why this is relevant that A clocks the implicature. The garage is a place where you can go get petrol. It's right around the corner. Again, it's not part of what's said, but it's certainly part of what's conveyed. Beautiful. Similar kind of case. A says, Smith doesn't seem to have a girlfriend these days. B responds, well, Smith's been paying a lot of visits to New York lately. Again, what's the implicature here? The implicature is something like, Smith has a girlfriend in New York. Again, what's driving it is, A needs to figure out the relevance of B's utterance. B is saying something that prima facie isn't relevant, but actually it is. And once A figures out why, they get the implicature. They get what's being told without what's being said. So again, in this case, the speaker implicates what they must be assumed to believe in order to get relevance to come through. Again, we can use the maxims to help us figure out what it is they're trying to convey when they're not explicitly saying it. So that's our first one, where the maxims are observed. Our second one is a kind of weird one. Remember, this is where a maxim's violated because of a clash. So it's helpful to know what we mean by clash. So that's basically where we have 2 maxims that force us to do conflicting things. I didn't do it. So here's an example again from Grice. A says, where does C live? And B responds, somewhere in the south of France. And the thought is, right, B is effectively put in a difficult position. Because of quantity, B should say explicitly, as much detail, where C lives. Right? If they live in Nice, cool. If they live in Marseille, cool. Right? If they live in Monaco, cool. They should say that, because that's the right level of detail. But the problem is, B has an issue with quality. B doesn't remember or know detailed enough, doesn't have enough evidence to say, oh yeah, they live in Marseille. So this is the best answer they can give, given quality. And again, quality being say what's true or what you have good evidence for. So B doesn't know anything more specific, or at least doesn't have enough evidence for anything more specific, so this is the best they can do. Again, do we see the kind of clash here? And this is the kind of thing that A can figure out. But B doesn't know anything more specific. This is as close as B can get. Again, because of the apparent clash between the two maxims. These are the kind of boring ones now. The fun ones are the flouting. So, when is the maxim flouted? Well, we basically have a speaker who makes it clear they're not following the conversational maxims, and this is going to generate implicatures. And actually, we can think about flouting of each kind of maxim. So I'll give you examples of each. Some of them are from Grice, some of them are other ones. When we think about flouting quality, and again, remember, quality is say what's true or what you have the best evidence for. Basically, cases of irony, metaphor, meiosis, hyperbole, these kinds of things are all going to have the relevant kind of implicatures. A nice example, A says Tehran's in Turkey, isn't it? And B replies, and London's in Armenia. So the implicature here is, no, Tehran is not in Turkey. Right? You absolute fool. Another one, you're the cream in my coffee. This was in Grice. Kind of gross, I think, but you know, whatever. Again, obviously not literal. Supposed to be some kind of implicature. I'll leave it to you to figure out what it is. Another really good one is someone who's wrecked a bar, right? And in the aftermath, you say he was a little intoxicated. You've all been there. Again, what are we doing in these cases? We're flouting the maxim, and in so doing, generating the implicature that, my God, he was overserved. Again, we see the idea? Everyone's in the know, or at least after B says it, A is immediately in the know, right? And hence people are kind of going to be able to work out what's being conveyed, even though it's not what's explicitly said. We can do the same with quantity. We might see something very silly. This is again from Grice. He says, war is war. And that's a very helpful thing to say. Thank you for the triviality. And the thought is, this is meant to implicate something like, look, war is terrible. There's no lamenting the tragedy. Another really good one that I quite enjoy is, and this is football, when somebody does something amazing on the pitch, and it's like meant to implicate like, this is such an incredible sport, it's so much fun to watch, but in fact they're just saying something absolutely banal. Again, that's a violation of quantity. You're telling me something that's not very informative, given I'm watching the football, listening to you talk, but conveying or implicating something like this is absolutely fucking magic. Another one, either John will come or he won't. Cool, thank you for saying something trivially true. But obviously this is meant to convey something like, I don't really give a shit whether John comes or doesn't. It's gonna happen, it'll be fine. A very famous one, I think we talked about this before, right, is the letter of recommendation case. So A asks B for a letter of recommendation for a job, and B writes in the letter all about how A is very good at tying their shoes and has excellent penmanship. And the implicature in the letter is that A is not at all qualified for the position they're applying for. It doesn't say this, but by adding a bunch of nonsense information, it conveys it. Again, in these cases, flouting the maxim to generate some more content. We can also do the same with relations. So this one, or sorry, this should be relevance. I don't know why I said relations. Keep that in mind. With regards to relevance, it's actually really hard. And to be honest, the best cases are going to be when conversation kind of breaks down. So this, unfortunately, happens a lot. I'm out with some friends, one of them's very drunk, and they come out with something that's just either really offensive, or really gross, or just completely fucking irrelevant. And what will then happen, 99 times out of 100, is I'll follow it up with like, well, how about the Mets, right? Which is not meant to say anything. It's meant to convey something like, fuck, let's talk about something else. Someone please fill in this dead silence, things just got awkward. So what's happening here is I'm violating relevance, talking about baseball, and what I'm trying to communicate is things just got really weird, or awkward, or you see the idea. Grice also talks about a very similar case when you're at a very fancy dinner party and someone is just like, I don't know, such and such is an old bag, and then another conversant is just like, the weather's been really lovely recently, hasn't it? And the idea is, just to quote Grice, implicates that the first person's remark shouldn't be discussed, maybe that A has committed a terrible social gaffe. Again, it's not said, that's supposed to be what's conveyed. And the last one, we're thinking about manner. And again, when we think about manner, it's literally the kind of sentential vehicle, the expression used. You get all sorts of things. So we might say something like, the corner of John's lip turns slightly upwards. We're not really saying he's smiling. He looks a bit like smiling, but it's not quite there. Another good one, Miguel produced a series of sounds corresponding closely to an aria from Rigoletto. What am I really trying to convey there? God, please never make me listen to that again. It wasn't sung well. And note, by sending it this way, by structuring the sentence this way, you get that across without actually saying it. Another really nice one is if someone asks you, oh, how do you get into your house? If you follow it up with, walk up to the front door, turn the handle clockwise as far as it goes, pull the door gently to you, then turn the key. The level of detail there, and the level of specificity is saying something not just about extra information, but also about, right, you should really pay attention because actually this is a little bit complicated. Again, do we sort of see how this goes? The general moves here? It's always going to be driven by breaking these rules, but breaking the rules in a way that everyone is aware you are breaking them. And by breaking them in a specific way, the conversants, the other people who are engaged in the conversation, can clock what extra you're trying to do. Cool? Questions on the general process? Okay. It's longer than I expected. So once we have all of this in hand, the examples that we were talking about can be made to make sense, right? He got drunk and drove home, but not in that order, right? That's just explicitly canceling the implicature. So, oh, you might have thought I meant that order. I didn't mean that, right? I didn't mean that, not in that order. Similarly, either he's a debar or he's hard at work, and that's all I know. That fits. That makes sense. That actually explains why we're just telling you the disjunction. rather than he's at the bar or he's at work. In this case, the speaker is violating the maximum quantity because they can't provide more information without violating quality. This is a version of the clash. And we can generate our own examples. It's not very hard to sort of use this framework and start applying it in a bunch of different cases. Okay. So what's really lurking here is a distinction that I think we've talked about once or twice, but I don't remember. And it's a distinction between what we'll call semantics and pragmatics. So much of what we've done has been about semantics. That is, figuring something like what the meanings of sentences are, or the meanings of parts of sentences. Put it here, how sentences of a language determine truth conditions. If you think about what we've been doing with regards to the first 3 or 4 weeks, where we're thinking about proper names and stuff like this, very much related to that project. But what we've arguably been talking about, at least for the last 2 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, is pragmatics. That's something like the inferences or actions that hearers and speakers do when they're engaged with or interpreting truth conditional meanings. A really cheap and cheery way to think about this is that semantics concerns something like language itself. This isn't quite right, but this is a rough and ready idea. Semantics concerns language itself as a representational tool. Pragmatics concerns how we use it, how we employ the tool, and the different ways we use it. Now, interestingly, once we have this semantics-pragmatics distinction, or at least both notions in hand, we can come back to that opening debate about the formalist and informalist. And we might think that actually, there's no fucking debate here. They're just talking past each other. The formalist is interested in semantics. And in fact, they've given us a story that maybe does okay with the semantic stuff. Or if it's not done yet, then they just need to keep improving their tools. Formal languages need to get better, but when they do, it's going to give us this. But what the formal languages will never do was give us this. But that's fine. They weren't meant to give us pragmatics. That's just a different damn thing. Pragmatics are how we use these tools, not the tools themselves. And the formal language was always a tool. It was always just meant to do semantics. If you think that that's what's going on, then it makes sense as to why some of these things happen. Again, to go way back. Let's look at these cases. So the weird cases about the material conditional, the if-then stuff. These are weird. I'm not going to lie, they are very weird. But are they weird because they give us the wrong truth conditions? Or are they weird because they seem to violate something like the conversational maxims? Here's a story we could tell. The reason this, say, if there's exactly 50 people, then there are exactly 5,000 people, is creepy, isn't because it gets the truth conditions of the claim wrong. It's that when we have an if-then, there's an implicature, that there's an association between the thing in the first bit and the thing in the second bit, the antecedent and the consequent. And there's clearly no connection between these two, or at least not in the right sort of way. And so it sets an alarm off, not because, again, it's semantically incorrect, but because it's pragmatically wrong. Much like what's going on with this. Either he's at the bar or he's hard at work, and he's at the bar. Again, semantically, perfectly fine. Pragmatically, and we know why. Because it's violating quantity. If you know he's at the bar, then you shouldn't tell us the disjunction. There's no need. That's useless information. The same thing with the body. So once we kind of have this semantic pragmatic distinction, and if we think that Grice's story tells us something lovely about how to make sense of pragmatics, again, maybe this formalism and formalism thing isn't really a debate. It's just two very different projects talking past each other. I think this is a lovely kind of thing to bring together because, again, one of the things we've touched upon several times has been something like this. Again, the Strauss and Russell distinction. The Gricean project versus a kind of broadly Russellian or Fregean story. This sort of stuff about, do we trust the formal tools, do we trust the informal tools? Well, at least in some cases we can have both. We can have our cake and eat it too. As long as we're very careful about what everybody's doing, on which parts of the story they're talking about. Okay. That's basically what I wanted. Before I kind of close up shop and move on, pause, ask questions on the Grice stuff. Again, if you haven't read the paper, I would very much suggest reading it. It's fun. You can kind of stop after he finishes all of the examples of conversational, because then he goes on for like 3 more pages about conventional implicatures, and that's a snooze fest. Okay. So, let me go back one. Yeah. So this kind of wraps up this chunk of the course. We had like 4 weeks on singular terms. So this was the Frege, Russell, Kripke, and then the puzzle about belief. And now we've had 3 weeks on broadly semantic stuff. So speech act things, Grice on the sort of intention-based semantics, and now Grice on implicatures. And those, at least roughly, give us 2 competing accounts of how language works. What I'd like to do in the last 2 weeks is focus on particular puzzles. So next week we're going to focus on something I find just endlessly fascinating. But hopefully you guys will too. And this is going to be about something we've already talked about a few times, and that's negative existentials. So we're going to try and figure out how to make sense of claims like Santa doesn't exist and unicorns don't exist. So particular or individual negative existentials and general negative existentials. How to make sense of these when, if they're true, it seems to suggest that the terms we're using don't have any semantic content. There's only one bit of reading, so there's a proper paper and then some supplements if you want to read it. Just read the Cartwright paper. It's quite short. It's maybe about 8 or 9 pages long. It's fun as well. Then there's also a supplement thing if you'd like to read it from Kripke, giving a sort of survey of a bunch of different views. Don't feel obliged. So we're going to talk about that. And then the last week, what we're going to do is we're going to pivot to talk about a really fun puzzle about how we ever know meaning even from our own heads. So this is Kripkenstein puzzle about addition, weirdly. So that's what we're going to do in 2 weeks' time. Next week, though, talk about negative existentials. Thank you guys for coming. Have a lovely week, and we'll see you all next week.